Hello there, folks, and welcome to Frontlines of Social Good, where we're going to bring you the latest news and insights from the world of philanthropy and fundraising. I'm Jay Frost. I'm your host. We're a little tardy today. I hope that's okay with you. We have had a couple of technical difficulties in pulling everyone together, but if you'll bear with us, I know you'll appreciate everything we're going to be discussing with you today. We're going to kick things off with the latest philanthropy news, as we usually do, covering the biggest gifts of the week and key government actions that are shaping the nonprofit sector. Next, we're going to, with our fingers crossed, dive into the challenges to government for public broadcasting and how we can address it with Jeff Streifels of Veritas Group. He's waiting in the wings, and we've had a little audio difficulty, but we're definitely going to try to bring him in because he has a lot to share with you, especially on this area of going from transactional membership models to transformational major gift strategies, which have been so important with the clients he's worked with and the sector as a whole in public broadcasting. Then we're going to welcome back two friends and friends of the sector, Nathan Chappell and Scott Rosenkrantz, to discuss their hot new bestseller, The Nonprofit AI Advantage, a comprehensive guide to implementing artificial intelligence in nonprofit organizations. They're going to explore how AI is reshaping philanthropy and what nonprofit leaders need to know to stay ahead. If you just picked up news of today's session off of the, let's say, LinkedIn, you may know that we're going to give away a copy of that new book today. So do stay with us, and we'll make sure that one of you is a lucky winner of that book, and another is going to receive a copy of The Generosity Crisis, if you can see it behind me. And then we're going to close out today with an end note on a historic anniversary that's quickly being forgotten here in the US. But before all that, let's dive into some significant changes in U.S. government policies impacting foreign aid and higher ed. We'll start with the news out of Washington. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has just announced that the U.S. Agency for International Development will cancel 83% of its programs. This decision follows a 6-week review aimed, as they say, at aligning foreign aid with national interests. Approximately 5,200 contracts will be terminated, affecting programs that have been deemed by the agency to not serve U.S. interests. The remaining 17% of programs will be managed by the State Department under Secretary Rubio. These cuts have led to the dismissal, at this point, of over 9,500 USAID employees. The Trump administration has announced the cancellation of $400 million in federal grants and contracts to Columbia University over the last few days, citing the institution's alleged failure to protect students from anti-Semitic harassment. The decision comes among heightened security of campus protests against Israel's military actions in Gaza, which have been very prominent in Columbia and set fire to demonstrations across the country last year. The university's New York campus has been a focal point for demonstrations advocating for an end to U.S. support for Israel and urging divestment for companies linked to the Israeli government. Protests have led to mass arrests, student suspensions, and the resignation of the university's president. The funding cut is part of a broader effort by the administration to address what it perceives as rising anti-Semitism on college campuses. And in fact, just this weekend, the Secretary of Education has sent a letter to 60 universities talking about an investigation into their activities to ensure that they are aligned with the university's, the administration's goals. More news on that as it develops. Now, here are our top 5 gifts of the week. First of all, Fordham University has received a $100 million gift from alumni Maurice and Carolyn Cuniff. This is the largest donation in the university's history. The funds are slated to be used to construct a state-of-the-art integrated science center on the Rose Hill campus and to expand STEM programs. The new facility will feature modern labs, research spaces, and classrooms. An anonymous donor has left $70 million to Grove City College to support student scholarships and academic programs. This is the largest gift in the college's history. The Saul and Joyce Brandman Foundation has pledged $20 million to UCLA to establish the Saul and Joyce Brandman Foundation Center for Lung Health, dedicated to advancing research and treatment for chronic lung diseases like COPD and asthma. The Paul M. Angel Family Foundation has made a $10 million gift to the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center at Rush University Medical Center. This donation aims to advance precision medicine in Alzheimer's research, and the funds will support development of personalized therapeutic approaches by leveraging over 3 decades of data and brain tissue samples collected from community-based studies. And finally, in our top 5, an anonymous donor has contributed $5 million to the Rotary Foundation to fund global polio eradication efforts, supporting vaccine distribution and immunization campaigns in high-risk regions. In fundraising news, Michigan State University has embarked on its most ambitious fundraising effort yet, aiming to raise $4 billion in support of student success, faculty research, and campus infrastructure. Now, in our top story today, public broadcasting. Public broadcasting in the U.S. is facing increasing financial and political pressure. Representative Claudia Tenney has introduced legislation to eliminate all federal funding for the public broadcasting service and national public radio. According to WRVO Public Media, supporters of the bill argue that taxpayer dollars should not fund public media organizations they perceive as politically biased. Opponents warn that the move could devastate local stations, especially in rural areas, where public broadcasters serve as one of the few sources of local news, educational programming, and emergency alerts. Currently, federal funding accounts for approximately 15% of PBS's budget, with NPR receiving about 1% of its total funding from the federal government. And while national organizations are less dependent on government support, many local public radio and television stations rely on federal grants for as much as 40% of their operating revenue. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which distributes these funds, primarily supports smaller stations, which lack the donor bases of large urban affiliates. If funding is cut, stations in less populated areas could face severe budget shortfalls, program reductions, or even closures. With these challenges ahead, public broadcasters are rethinking fundraising strategies. And we have someone right here today who can tell us a bit about that. And that is Jeff Schreifels, co-founder of the Veritas Group and an expert on nonprofit philanthropy. Schreifels has helped nonprofits shift away from transactional giving models, empowering them to build sustainable, mission-driven donor relationships. So now, let's all cross our fingers together and hopefully be able to hear from Jeff. Jeff, welcome to the program. It's really good to at least see you. And we cannot yet hear you. So we're going to see if we can adjust that. Jack, are you able to adjust that on your end? If not, we'll see if we can call him on the phone.
Nothing I can do now.
Nothing you can do from there. All right. So Jeff, we're going to give you a call right now and see if this does the trick. This is a new one, folks, so bear with us.
Hey there.
Hi there. Thank you so much, Jeff. Well, it just shows that no technology is completely, without blemish. So thank you, first of all, for doing this. We want to make sure that that people can at least hear you, if not see you. So if you're looking at a bit of me, you'll know that that's the reason why. Jeff, I know that there's a lot to discuss here. Maybe we can start with just talking a bit about the situation that we're in right now. How serious is it really from your perspective? Before we dive into some of the strategies to help public broadcasters and maybe others try and adjust for this kind of new reality.
Well, I think it's very serious. I do think that in the history of changing of administrations, especially going from a Democrat to a Republican administration, there's always been a threat to public media over the last 20 years in all these different election cycles. But this one carries much more weight. As you can already see, there's a ton of slashing going on. And so it definitely seems imminent that this is going to happen.
And you may need to turn down the audio on your computer while we're talking to avoid an echo. As we jump into this, I know that you've worked with a number of public broadcasters to try and adjust for this reality. Can you talk about the limits of membership models and then maybe how you've helped stations to set a kind of a new strategy for sustainability?
So the limit with membership models is that you create a number of donors who are locked into thinking that this is all they need from them. You give your $10 a month, you'll get your tote bag, and every year you'll get a renewal notice. And they're not asked to do more than that. And that's just for a $10 donor, but we do this also for $100 a month donors, $5,000 a year donors, $10,000 a year. If you look at the data, you will see this where donors are giving the same amount every year. And these donors are giving hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars to other organizations. We know this. And the reason is that they've locked them into this membership idea, and we never ask them to give beyond that. So that's the limit of membership. The great side of membership is that it creates great donor loyalty. It's income that's always coming in. But the downside for especially those who can give bigger gifts is they get locked into that mindset.
And that being locked into that mindset, is that largely a function of what they've seen work before, and that's why they're trying to make the adjustment? Or is it just bad fundraising behavior?
It's not bad fundraising behavior. It's just that over time, they've relied too heavily on that. So for acquisition and cultivating smaller donors, that membership strategy is amazing. And they've done an incredible job with it over the last 20, 25 years with it. It's now getting more costly. And one of the downsides is that they haven't created strategies to move those donors to mid and major gifts in a way that other nonprofits have done.
Now, I know that part of the issue there might also be what donors are accustomed to. If you have started supporting your local station and you got the tote bag and you got the mug and you feel like you've done your part, maybe it's difficult to help people readjust to the relationship.
That's right. And so what we have found in the public stations is that the mid-level space where you're just introducing them to a different relationship, in a sense, you're starting to reach out to them with a person, changes the relationship and moves them out of that membership mentality. And so that's why it's so important for all public stations to have not only a major gift program, but also that mid-level program to start introducing those donors who've been in that membership program for so long to realize, oh, we actually need more than that annual membership. And did you know that there's X, Y, and Z that you could fund? So it's changing that relationship.
Could you break that down a little bit for us, almost taking us through the steps? Let's say you're at a station that historically really relied on those members. That's a big chunk of your revenue. That's all they know. And now you've got to start them from scratch. What does that look like in terms of the initial messaging, who sends it, how often, and then how do you scale that over time to help people really become not just transactional donors, but partners?
It's not necessarily taking them from scratch. You take these good donors, these members, and with a mid-level program, for those donors that have hit a certain dollar figure, whatever that station deems as a mid-level, could be $1,000 cumulative in 1 year or above, or 500 or above, depending on how big that station is. That is when a mid-level rep is starting to reach out to them, saying, thank you so much for your membership and your gifts that you've done in the past. I want to be able to tell you there's other programs and projects within our station that also need funding. And I want to be able to tell you about those. and you start to reach out and understand who the donor is. Why do they care about the station? What are their passions and interests? And you start moving that relationship from just membership to membership plus, hey, we've got all these other things you want to fund. And we've seen great success in moving those membership donors into greater amounts. So, for example, we've seen so many donors move from like $1,200 a year and still get that $100 a month. But in addition, they find out more things, and now they're giving $5,000, $10,000 a year. And they have the means, they were never asked.
Right.
They were never told other projects could be needed other than their annual membership. And so that's how that relationship changes. That's how donors become enlightened to all the different projects and programs of public media.
Now, I know part of this may also be message dependent, and not just to the individual, but to everybody collectively. I mean, if you have, as WAMU right here in our area is doing right now, they're having their new, their seasonal appeal. And so that messaging is going out to every listener. So you've got that, and then you've also got what's coming to you. And if they do have a program that's for mid-level donors, as you've described it, and that messaging is a little different, how do you make sure that the message that's being sent out to the whole world doesn't in any way conflict with the message that you're sending to individuals?
Well, that requires a lot of planning. And so when we work with a mid-level team, we're also working with the direct response team. The team that the membership team. And so we need to know everything that's happening with membership. What's going out to those donors? What are the messages we're saying? When are the annual drive funds, pledges that we're getting? What's the message happening? So that the mid-level rep is in concert with what's going out with direct response.
And when you think about that, and you think about it from a donor perspective, you must have had this experience too. Can you talk about what that was like for you as you saw stations that maybe had started to initiate a program like this one, whether or not they're under your counsel, and those who have not, because most of us are in an area where we have more than one station. So what has the experience been like for you as you've watched stations try to implement some of these strategies, especially in comparison to those who haven't?
Yeah, that's a great question. So
we are going to call him right back.
There you go.
There we go.
Multiple problems today, but 4 years ago, we started a pilot program with 4 stations. And we introduced mid and major gifts into the full array of strategies for the nonprofit. What we saw was a 50% increase in mid and major gifts in just 1 year, because we started introducing mid and major gift strategies into the station. So they saw a huge revenue increase. They saw more donors engaged. They saw low attrition rates. It totally changed their program. And they were still able to do everything they did on the membership side. But in addition to that, they started seeing much higher revenue.
What does this do in terms of their thinking about government? And here I'm thinking about both the stations, but also the public. There's a misperception, as there was with AID, which we talked about at the top of the show, with public radio and public television, that there's all this government funding for it. Yeah. And there actually isn't a lot of it. It's very meaningful, especially for stations in rural areas and others. But nevertheless, it's not the whole pie. But the public perception is that it is. So as you start to make these adjustments, or the stations do, What happens to that understanding? Do people start to say, I get it now, I need to participate in a more active way?
Exactly. The public media has done a pretty good job, I would say, over the last 10 years, really highlighting the fact that government funding isn't a huge part of their overall budget, that it really is up to donors. Yet now we're at a time where it's even greater, and that stations really need to tell their listeners, hey, 10% of our funding, 40% of our funding, maybe only 1%, it's still significant. That may go away. Now more than ever, we need your help, and sustained help year over year.
And have the stations themselves gotten that message? Because the whole principle here is that organizations of every type have to recognize that it's important to invest in programs like the ones you've described in order to ensure that they are able to carry on their work tomorrow. So are the stations that have been more reluctant to undertake, let's say, mid-level and major gift programs, planned giving programs, are they also getting the message and starting to take action?
They are. Not at the pace that I would love to see them, but from where they were 5 years ago, yes, they've embraced the idea that they have to build up their major gift and mid-level programs in order to sustain themselves. They can't rely just on membership any longer. However, I think with the threat of government funding going totally away, we'll see more and more stations say, we need to bring in another revenue source. We have these good donors, and we need a strategy around how to ask them for bigger gifts. We need to show them everything we're doing, what it actually costs, so that people realize what they could do and inspire them to give more.
Jeff, as you're talking about this, it strikes me that most of us rely to some degree or other on public broadcasting, even in a world of streaming media. But these lessons are not just applied to this. They're across the board with other nonprofits that are also facing a whole variety of challenges, especially on government retrenchment of funding. So and you work with a lot of those other kinds of organizations. What's the big takeaway for the whole nonprofit sector? Is there something that you have seen public broadcasters learn that can be applied to lots of other big and small organizations?
Well, it's always don't rely on one revenue source or a couple of revenue sources. You need to rely on multiple revenue sources for your budget. And if you look at the full entire pipeline from acquisition to planned giving, are you making it as easy as possible for a donor to give to their heart's content? And that means, do you have a strategy for mid-level and major gifts? Do you have a planned gift? All of this needs to be made available to donors. And so if you're super reliant on that government funding, the threat is so great right now. Had they been doing a planned giving program 15 years ago, that could have gotten them through today. We saw that in COVID. Those arts organizations that had a really strong planned giving program 15 years prior made it through COVID because of that strategy. Same today.
Jeff, thank you so much for all of this. Thank you also for putting up with all the technology. Although I think you're accustomed to both a radio environment because of your client work, but also because you do a podcast yourself, isn't that right?
Yeah. That's why I was like, we're all set up for it. No idea why this isn't working.
So if you'd like to hear more of Jeff or see him, there are ways to do that. Jeff, how do you recommend people learn more about your work at Veritas, but also to hear your podcast?
Go to veritasgroup.com. And everything is there. Our podcasts, our free white papers, our blog, all the links are there to learn about what we do and how we do it. A lot of free material there for you.
And that's Veritas, VERT, PUS. Yes, I want to make sure people know group, yes.com. Thank you so much for this, Jeff. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jay. I appreciate it.
That is definitely a new one for us, but I'm really glad that he was able to patch in at least through the audio. You have a lot to share with us, and I'm sure it's something that you're experiencing even with your own public broadcasting stations and maybe with your organization. So our thanks again to Jeff for weathering that storm and being with us. Now I want to jump to, of course, another subject and two other guests I'm really happy to have here. And in fact, it's a great segue in a sense, because everything we just talked about moving donors who may be thinking of us one way into thinking about us in a really rich and impactful way is something that these two gentlemen have been working on for a long time, and working on particularly today through the use of artificial intelligence. And as I mentioned before, we have with us Nathan Chappell and Scott Rosenkrantz, two friends who are the bulwark behind DonorSearch AI. If you don't know much about that, we'll make sure that you learn more about it in the next few minutes, as well as get a link to it. But the main reason they're here today is to talk about their latest book, Nathan's latest. You may know him as the author of The Generosity Crisis, co-author with two other authors. But today he's working with his colleague, Scott, in the release of their newest book. And I'll let them introduce that to you, as well as tell you all about it. Nathan, Scott, it's so great to have you here. Thank you so much for being here to share.
Yeah, it's always great to connect, Jay. And
now, yes, let me turn that up because I couldn't hear you. There we go.
Okay, I'm like, oh my gosh, last thing we need is another audio issue. No, it's great to be here, and thanks for everyone tuning in and sticking with us. It's great to be able to spend a little bit of time and just give you a preview, kind of showcase of the nonprofit AI, why it was created, and honestly, I think the path of writing the book is actually fairly interesting in this day and age where everything is changing and AI is making its way into the publisher's toolbox as well. So great to be here.
So which of the two of you came up with this title? It's a long one, but it's very clear. The Nonprofit AI Advantage, a comprehensive guide to implementing artificial intelligence in nonprofit organizations. Scott, was that you or Nathan?
It was the shortest out of the options I provided.
To be honest, SEO is such a big deal. And so the subtitle of the book was created specifically for SEO. So, nonprofit AI, just to allow it surface, but yeah, the word social impact and then spelling out artificial intelligence was another SEO consideration. So yeah, we played around with it a lot. We actually used GPT quite a bit to help us understand how to optimize the SEO in the book itself. So yeah, strategy all the way around.
And I know that content also was a collaborative effort. So you've got your two big brains here, but you did rely a little more on AI here in a very careful, thoughtful, collaborative way in order to create the content. Isn't that right?
I mean, Scott wanted to do it really irresponsibly. I kept on having to keep him on the rails. I mean, he was just like, let's just push play and get the whole book written for us. No, it's so interesting. I was actually talking with Brian Crimmins yesterday. So he's the co-author of Generosity Crisis. That book came out, I think it was 13 or 14 days before ChatGPT was released. And yesterday he and I were laughing about how when ChatGPT came out, we were looking at each other thinking, this is probably the last book ever truly written by humans. And, as we're, and proof point is that there's 3 typos in Generosity Crisis. And so I know we have a couple good friends on this podcast. So Brady's probably found those typos. I don't think there's any typos because I actually went and double checked with ChatGPT at the end to make sure we didn't have typos in this book. But, all said and done, I think when Scott and I approached this, and Scott can talk more about how we used a lot of different AI tools as a kind of thought partner and to help us kind of reword things and things like that. But essentially at the end of the day, like we're in this kind of in between time where, even our publisher was like, is this okay? Is this not okay? And like going back and forth of like, well, we didn't just copy and paste, but humans had to build this. And it's very interesting because I told Brian this yesterday, I'll bet you a year from now, literally exponential technology, a year from now, a GPT like GPT Pro can't do this yet, but can get closer, can write an entire book on its own just by asking you a bunch of questions and prompts. So we're not forever away from that being a possibility. So this is a weird amalgamation in a very transparent way. And actually, we took a lot of pride and thought, well, we'd be total hypocrites if we don't use AI to write a book called Nonprofit AI. So yeah, Scott, I don't know if you want to talk more about kind of that thought process and how we used AI in the book.
Yeah, and actually, anyone, once you do get your copy, and I think we're giving away a copy on today's podcast,
Yeah.
right? I think the first page when you open up to it is kind of like a little preamble about how we use it, right? I mean, Nathan, we've been working in this field for 8 years now. We've done a lot of talks, a lot of, education with nonprofits, with consultants, and so on. So we pulled on a lot of our own personal experience, and the subtitle, even though it's long, it's very true, right? Because it's not just practical. It's not just, all right, here's prompts or here's use cases, but it's comprehensive. I mean, Nathan does a great job of always being kind of 10 steps ahead. And where is the sector going? Where is the technology going? And how do we need to be aware of that in today's world? And then I do a lot of hands-on with clients. And so we bring both kind of like the forward looking, but also the what can you do right here, right now? And then how do you look at different frameworks to make sure you're applying it? So like it really covers almost every single topic that is being discussed whenever we have conversations with people. But we came up with the outline ourselves. We came up with a lot of the examples ourselves, a lot of the analogies that we've been using over and over, and just use ChatGPT to help kind of like refine, reframe, make it a little bit clearer, clean it up a little bit, come up with different concepts that maybe we haven't applied and so on.
Collaborating with other humans is tough. Is collaborating with AI easier?
Yes. I can say, and being the second book, I mean, this book, what Brian Crimmins and I really struggle with the most. I mean, it took 2 years to write Generosity Crisis. One is because I'm a perfectionist. And honestly, if I didn't have a publisher deadline, I'd still be writing it because I just wouldn't, it would not be perfect. But, Brian and I spent so much time, if I reflect back, we met every week, after hours, like every week. And most of the time it was like looking at the sky, like what's an analogy that sounds like this, or what's an example of something that feels like this, but it applies here to the nonprofit sector. And if we count up the number of hours that we spent doing that, I mean, like probably 100 hours doing that. And like generative AI obviously has access to the entire, world's information. So Scott and I were like really clear of like, hey, we want to describe something that's like this. Give us 10 examples of that. And it's like freaking magic. And, so I think it just so much easier in some ways, but really frustrating too. Like we did a podcast on this exact topic is that how long did it take us to write this book, Scott? It wasn't like forever.
I mean, time's a man-made construct, so I can't really answer that. But I think last summer we started. Is that right? We were working on the other book.
Right. Yes, we're actually working on the sequel to Generosity Crisis, which for those that care, that will get back on track after this book comes out. So not that long, like 6 months when we got really to it. And it took a lot of late nights and things like that. And we're both traveling and syncing up at airports and stuff like that. But I think it made the process a lot faster in some ways and then more frustrating in other ways. So we talked about on our podcast, like from the time that we started writing the book, like our first what would we want to make sure that we include? What did we miss in our outline? Things like that. To right before we submitted our final manuscript, we actually saw the technology change pretty dramatically. Like from what like GPT or Claude or Perplexity, and we used all of them because we're like kind of testing them and publish their own generative model. And it was super clunky. I like in the beginning, I'm like, this is like not that helpful. Like helpful with an outline, but it can't even like digest a chapter without getting confused. By the end, like we were seeing the token window open up, so the context window is like much larger by the end, just 6 months later, again, exponential technology. And it's pretty cool to see. Like we actually were able to witness that process while we were writing this book, and for it to actually become more and more helpful. Literally, we always say today is the worst AI you'll ever use, and that was proven to us like over and over again.
I don't
It's crazy because the book isn't even out yet, and the tools have also evolved, right? So if we were writing it now and it coming out 6 months from now, it would be a different book maybe.
Yeah. Wow, that's interesting because I guess another question could be, do you want a book like this to be constantly evolving through the use of AI, so that it's always, it's not just topical, it's always practical in the way that I'm sure this book is. Sure. But before going into that, there are people in our audience who are very familiar with AI, and there are those who are not at all familiar with it. So what is it about this book that's going to help people to take the leap in a productive way for their organizations?
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, go ahead, Scott.
I think, again, because everyone is at different places on their journey, and everyone has different reasons for not being further along, right? And because we cover the theoretical and then all the way to the practical, we cover the whole spectrum, and we should be able to address any of those concerns, whether it's, I don't know a tool to get started, or I can't think of a use case that would apply to me in my role, or I want to make sure I'm doing it responsibly and I don't want to make any missteps there. All of that is what we want to cover, because again, we know that the nonprofit sector needs to move ahead, that each organization needs to move ahead, each individual needs to move ahead, and you need to get over your individual hurdles to be able to just continue along that journey. You never reach it, right? You're always working towards being more and more efficient with the tool that you have accessible.
And I would add, AI is so broad, right? I mean, it's everything and nothing. Like it's now, this ubiquitous layer that's in everything, on top of everything, embedded. And, to Scott's point, there are different reasons why people are at different levels, either because they're very risk adverse, because they actually don't understand. They want to be prudent and take precautions on using AI, and they will not use it until they know how to responsibly. And then others are far down the path. We've been fortunate to work with a lot of early adopters throughout for the last 5 to 7 years. And they're looking to unlock the next level. And so the book is truly, to its name, a comprehensive guide, to essentially amplify AI for social impact. It starts out with the basics. Like, it literally starts out the history lesson. Well, first, it's like it does a little bit of a recap from Generosity Crisis of like, this is not just a thing. Like, this is not just a new tool that like is fun to play with. This is something that is absolutely needed in a dire way. Innovation is needed. I mean, based on your entire previous, interview, Jay, like, we need innovation in the sector to amplify impact. AI, we actually go into the whole history of AI. It's got this really interesting history, and then some mechanics of what it is and the different types of AI, machine learning versus, generative, and kind of how that's come together. And in fact, I actually ran the book through Notebook LM and created a small Notebook LM. I shared it with you, but I'll put it in the chat because we have a small number of people on this podcast, on this webinar. They might be interested, and just listen to the recap of it, and I'll give you kind of the essence of it. And at the end of the day, to your point of wanting to make it more practical, it goes into lots of use cases. This is where Scott's work was so helpful in saying, hey, this is like the work that we did with this organization and that organization, and bringing in use cases in pretty much 2/3 of the book. So really practical examples, but all grounded, obviously, in the responsible and beneficial framework that we've created with fundraising AI. So I do think it will get some people started in their journey, and I think it will unlock the potential to amplify impact for others. At the end of the day, we're essentially, the future of our sector is going to be determined at this moment. Like, I don't know if people realize like how significant this moment is, where anything is possible, where we have the tools in this democratized technology to do things that were never before imaginable. And the next 3 to 5 years, we'll look back and be like, did we seize this moment? And so I'm really hopeful that this book is timed in a way that really gets people to think about what that means, for them personally, for their organization, for the future of their sector.
Another thing I want to mention about the book is,
sorry, Jay, we're going to interview you in a second.
Yeah. We came with our own questions. Most books on AI as of late in the last 2 years are almost exclusively on generative AI, and kind of disregarding that there's any other type of AI, right? But again, Nathan and I, we've been working in predictive AI for 8 years, way before AI was as cool as it is. So we want to make sure that this wasn't just a generative AI book, right? So for we have chapters on how to use AI at your nonprofit organization if you're in human resources, or if you're in finances, or if you're in operations, And then for each of those, we talk about, here's some examples for predictive AI and how you would use it, versus here's some examples for generative AI, and then even into automation. So we want to make sure that all kind of all of those buckets are covered, and it's not just here's some prompts for ChatGPT and only solely focused on that.
I was going to ask you about that, so you've answered the question. You anticipated it. Yes, proof in a way that the human element here is still, in some respects, at least superior at interpreting what I might have been thinking. I did want to suggest that maybe we prompt the audience, and we see if people have questions here rather than my questions or even your questions. We see if there's some questions from the audience, and we pick the 2 best questions in order to decide who gets these 2 books. So go ahead if you have a question, list your question here. A comment would be fine too. We're going to take a look at that, and we're going to select the 2 winners of these 2 books, the new book, as well as my copy on my shelf of the signed edition of The Generosity Crisis, on the basis of what you put in the chat right now. So we'll give you a minute to do that. And while I'm doing that, there was 2 things that each of you said that I wanted to touch on. Scott, you talked before about efficiency, which I think is a really important word. It's what a lot of us maybe think of when we think about the potential for AI. And so I wanted to throw that to you, Nathan, and say, is efficiency the thing that is most powerful? And then I also want to throw a question back to you, Scott, after he's done with that, so you can chew on this, which is that Nathan was talking about the, whether or not we are rising to the moment and doing all the things with AI that really can be done. And I'd love for you to answer after Nathan talks about whether efficiency is really the thing, whether we are really meeting the moment. So, Nathan?
Well, I mean, it's a really good question. Efficiency is definitely a thing. It depends on what type of AI we're talking about, though. And so when we talk about predictive AI is about accuracy. So it's about taking lots of information and distilling it down into actionable information. That's about efficiency because one is that it'd be enormously time consuming to try to distill all the intricacies of like all the data points and what they mean, probably virtually impossible from a human perspective, but it's about, providing that pinpoint accuracy. There's lots of generative AI application that's about efficiency too. I mean, frankly, it does things for me every day that frankly, either I wouldn't do because it's just doing it the old way is just too exhausting. But it also can be about creativity. So I don't want to say it's only about efficiency. What we underestimated back in 2017, 2018, where we thought what roles would AI kind of surpass or replace or augment, humans. We thought that humans that, creativity, empathy, and strategy were basically untouchable. Now, obviously with the significant advances of generative AI, we understand that AI can be very creative and unlock a lot of creative potential. And it can also be very strategic and also can display signs of being empathetic, although it can't be empathetic, display signs of being empathetic. And at that point, we had to rethink what it means to be human. And we talk about this. We have a chapter in the book called Building a Culture of Curiosity, which I've written about a lot. So if we think about efficiency and we think about creativity, the key in both of those is just being curious and asking the question, what if? Like, what if AI could do this thing versus let's just, try to save time here or do this here. Scott talks a lot about, ensuring that when we have that dividend of time, that we actually apply it to more human-centric things.
So he kind of jumped into where I was going, but
Typical.
But Nathan does a lot of conversation on the creating a culture of curiosity. And I mean, there are tools that have been around for years that we still aren't using to its fullest potential. And all it is about a limitation on curiosity. So you're always, I mean, we have, as a team building, kind of thing, every week we have a most amazing humans competition where you submit videos from Reddit or Instagram, whatever, about all these different people doing wild things. And it's just a constant example of people pushing their body or cars or whatever it is to the limit because they had a curiosity of, well, if I try, can I do this? And so cars have been around for, decades, right? 100 years, whatever. And we're still coming up with new ways to use it. AI is such a different tool because it's not just here or wasn't here and now it is. It's constantly evolving. I don't think we're ever going to be able to catch up with its full potential, but that doesn't mean that we can't always push the limits of what we're thinking we can do with it.
Good answers, certainly. And now maybe if I can ask you each to give a 30-second response to a couple of the questions here, The first one has to do with, let me see, checking to make sure that AI is not further contributing to biases and inaccuracies. Is that something you both are tackling in this book?
We talk about this a lot. I mean, it essentially is the essence of fundraising.ai, which created the first framework. People should check out fundraising.ai for a lot of information here and 70-something hours of video on this topic. But one is that I think number one is that we have to condition ourselves now and increasingly in the future to ask the question every single day, just because we can do something technologically doesn't mean we should. And so before we think about biases and inaccuracies, we have to essentially align our use of AI with our personal values and our organizational values. After that, there's lots of practical ways of doing this. We're talking about human plus AI ways of essentially reducing bias. You'll never not have bias, but ensuring that you're not contributing to, a future state that's not helpful. We also then, really quick, will say that we can't evaluate AI in the short term. We can't evaluate the benefits of AI and how it helps us today. We must also burden us with the thought of what impacts or unintended consequences AI might have in the future. So the nonprofit sector, we have to look at it in both domains, the current use and what it can do for us today, but what might those impacts be in the future. And so there's a lot to take on, and we cover this quite a large extent in the book as well.
And Scott, maybe you can tackle the one about guardrails. I don't know if you can see it in the chat, but
how are we responsibly building guardrails in our sector to ensure early adopters share best practices and not share protected IP? And again, that goes to, and I think we actually have a tenet in the fundraising AI framework of continuous learning and sharing and contribution, making sure that you aren't protecting that just for your own needs. Obviously, there is IP, but doing what's best in the interest of the sector as a whole. We are a very cohesive group, right? And very kind of, for better or worse, a cliquey group, but we all work well together, and we're all like-minded and interested in doing good and doing good well. So using it, if you have anything along those lines that you think is a best practice, make sure you put it out there, because it's going to benefit not just you, the people you're working with, but those that they expand it to as well. So I think it's just a matter of, again, having that culture of collaboration and trying to move away from, well, I just want to keep it because it's good for me.
Thank you both very much for this. We do have other questions here. I know we won't be able to tackle them all today. We are grabbing the names and email addresses of a couple of the folks here. If you receive an email from us, that means that you have won, and we will send you a note so we can get your address and then send you a copy of the book. So thank you very much for participating in that, and everybody for including your questions. Scott, Nathan, if people want to both learn about this book, but also just learn about your work, and to listen to your podcast, what's the best way to start?
LinkedIn. We're both active on LinkedIn. You can go to Scott Rosenkrantz LinkedIn, Nathan Chappelle, but also fundraising.ai is where we have the fundraising AI website, the framework, our podcasts. You can listen to our podcast. It's a fundraising AI podcast on Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your podcasts, also on YouTube. Nonprofit AI will have its own book. It does have its own LinkedIn, or its own web page. It does have its own LinkedIn page right now. So that's probably the most active place, or DonorSearch.
Again, thank you both. Yes.
Yeah, no, I want to say, so I put in the chat the Notebook LM distillation. If you're not familiar with Notebook LM, this would be a great way to get oriented with it. Just send me a DM on LinkedIn and I'll share it with you that way. If it's not working and letting me share it, I'll just need your email address. Yeah, I want to thank everyone for joining in. We love this community. And Brady, you and I can talk about what keeps Scott and I up at night with the future of humanity. And so that's probably another podcast just on its own. Actually, we could just dedicate, well, maybe have you on as a guest to talk about that. In any case, yeah, Jay, thank you for having us. And of course, the book is on pre-order right now on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, wherever good books are sold. And we just, yeah, thanks everyone. For me, it's, people who care enough to listen in and tune in gives me a lot of hope in that we're taking this moment seriously.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Scott. It's good to see you here. Thank you so much for sharing about the book. Now, before we wrap up today, here's what's coming up next in the series. on March 13th. That's this Thursday in our How to Raise series. That's all CFRE accredited. We have Plan Giving 101, launching your program in 2025 with Tony Martignetti. Tony also has the Tony Martignetti Nonprofit Radio, so you may be very familiar with his work. He's brilliant on the subject of planned giving, especially for those who don't know anything about it. He can talk in the complexity of it, but he can make it real clear and simple. That's again on Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern. And then on March 18th, we'll explore the future of nonprofit tech in Game-Changing Tech for Nonprofits, What's Next and Why It Matters, with tech entrepreneur Jay Love and digital marketing strategist Julia Campbell, talking about innovations, of course, in that world of social media, for which she is so well known. She's going to be introducing her new book, Minimalist Marketing for Nonprofits. You can visit the DonorSearch website for more details on any of that. DonorSearch, of course, is the sponsor of this series, as well as the two others we do under the Philanthropy Masterminds brand. And all of that's available for you at donorsearch.net under the Resources tab. Now, I want to just add one last item before we all move away today. 5 years ago this week, the world shut down. Today, in fact, is the anniversary of the beginning of the COVID pandemic for most of us in most of our parts of the country. Streets emptied, hospitals overflowed, and a virus that we barely understood reshaped every part of our lives. We lost time, we lost security, and we lost people. Officially, COVID-19 took 7 million lives globally, 1.2 million here in the United States. But excess mortality data suggests that the real global number is possibly 19 to 36 million. 5 years later, what do we remember? How do we remember it? Remember for a moment the impact on nonprofits in the US. According to A Shock to the Status Quo, a report from the independent sector, COVID-19 delivered a massive blow to our world of nonprofits. 85% of human services nonprofits and 97% of arts and culture groups canceled fundraising events. More than 80% of organizations suspended programs. Over half saw a drop in donations. Job losses hit hard, with 47% of arts and culture groups and 37% of human services nonprofits furloughing staff. And despite the crisis, we adapted. By 2023, 60% of nonprofits had engaged in strategic planning. 44% launched new online programs, and efforts to secure funding ramped up, with 42% of organizations starting new donor recruitment programs. While financial struggles continued, layoffs dropped to just 10% in 2023, down from nearly 50% in 2020. And still, demand for services surged, with 46% of nonprofits reporting increased need, up from just 22% in early 2020. Government funding played a major role in shaping nonprofit survival during this period. 54% of nonprofits saw changes in funding, and 80% received increases, but 20% faced cuts. The pandemic changed nonprofits' operations across the board, possibly for good. But what do we remember? During a visit to the UK for this series, I took a walk along the Thames and I saw something quite extraordinary. The National COVID Memorial Wall, stretching for many meters, 150,000 red hearts, each representing a life lost. Most of them are handwritten messages from children who lost parents or parents who lost children. And yet here in America, where we lost 7 times as many people, there is no national memorial, no collective space, no equivalent to the Vietnam War memorial, no quilt like the one for AIDS victims. Instead, we talk about the role of government in public health, mask mandates, the safety of vaccines. That's when we talk about it at all. In April 2020, just a month after the crisis began, writer Giulio Vincent Gambuto released a prophetic essay entitled "Prepare for the Ultimate Gaslighting." You can still find it today on Medium or on his website. In that essay, he predicted that once the pandemic passed, powerful forces would try to erase our trauma, make us doubt our own loss and suffering, to push us back to normal as quickly as possible. Does that sound familiar? There is a resistance, not just to public health policies, but to the very idea that COVID mattered. Now even the numbers themselves are challenged, and what we experienced in the nonprofit sector is barely a footnote. but we must remember. Milan Kundera wrote, "The struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting." Nonprofits play a vital role in preserving memory, advocating for justice, and shaping a future that learns from the past. If we fail to remember, not only do we dishonor those we lost, but we weaken the very foundation of the sector's mission to create a more just and compassionate world. Let's honor those we've lost by going out there and creating one. This is Frontlines for Social Good. I'm Jay Frost. See you next time. Take care.